People all set.
Okay, fantastic. So, my name is Victoria Krumholtz. I'll be presenting the article today, An IRT Examination of the Psychometric Functioning of Negatively Worded Personality Items. So to begin, I just want to clarify some of the components in this article that were mentioned in the title as well. To start off with, the item response theory, IRT, is actually a paradigm that kind of works for the design, analysis, and scoring of tests often, or surveys. It's kind of, I wanted to make a comparison to the classical test theory, which is another paradigm that was kind of earlier developed, because the CCT, again the classical test theory, it's more simple. So it kind of focuses on the samples, what are the specific questions being asked, those individual items. So there's not a lot of variation within it. It's a very linear relationship based on the questions and then how well you're doing. So then the IRT was developed to give a more nuanced approach. So it doesn't look just at the sample, it actually looks at sort of what we've learned about latent variables. So it kind of looks at the question, the population answering the questions, and then what sort of unobservable behaviors or unobservable variables could also be influencing this relationship. So it's kind of looking at those properties of the items rather than just like the questions. So it's not always a linear relationship, it can be non-linear. But this is really important in this study because it's looking at information at the option level, so not just the items themselves, the questions, but other variables that might be behind them. One way you might have heard about item response theory is it's actually used in a lot of large-scale testing. So for the GRE, for example, if you've ever taken a computerized adaptive test, which means for the first section you might take a math portion, but then the second math portion you take will actually be based on how well you did in that first portion. So if you did really well, they might up the difficulty level, but if you did really poorly, they might keep it the same or lower the difficulty level. So that's one way where you might have seen it before. But then what are positive and negative worded items? These are on questions or surveys. And an example of this would be if I asked, are you normally a happy person? That would be a positively worded item. So the opposite of that is, are you an unhappy person most of the time? So that's kind of the negative of happiness. So how and why are they used? Again, they're often used on surveys, and then I'm sure you've actually kind of all seen before or read in an article where they're incorporated because on surveys you want to make sure people aren't just randomly circling responses and filling it out. So that's acquiescence bias, which means people normally want to have a tendency to agree with all the questions. So if you had a scale of 1 to 10, they might just go down circling 9s and 8s. So by throwing in a negatively worded item in there, you're making sure they're actually carefully reading the questions rather than just blowing through them. Because if they answered that, hey, 10, they're normally a happy person, but then they answer again 10, they're normally an unhappy person, you can kind of tell that maybe they're not really paying attention. So the purpose of this study is really to tell if these items are psychometrically indistinguishable, meaning they want to know if I answered 10, I'm normally a happy person, but then I also answer 1, I'm normally an unhappy person, 1 for normally I'm an unhappy person, so I'm not. So that should correlate, because it should equal out to, yes, I'm normally I'm normally a happy person. So in the present study, first they kind of look at parameters. Those are kind of the unobservable variables that might be influencing the different questions. I wanted to clarify that the parameters are discrimination and difficulty. So discrimination in this case is kind of the correlation between your response and then the question being asked. So kind of the ability. But then difficulty is very clearly the difficulty of the question itself. So in those cases, there are two hypotheses they introduced were, first, negatively worded items will have lower discrimination parameters than correspondingly positive worded items. So in this case, they're asking if negative worded items have all these other variables influencing them, because they don't think it's just the question itself, then it might not be as clear how you as an individual will answer or have a response. So hypothesis 2 is negatively worded items will provide less information than correspondingly positive worded items, like for instance on a personality scale, because again there could be other variables influencing it. So in the first study, they had 545 participants, students at a large Midwestern college. As you can see, the majority were female, Caucasian, and the mean age was 19.7. All participants filled out a paper and pencil Goldberg adjective checklist. Again, we talked about that in class, so ocean, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. In this case, they did refer to neuroticism as emotional stability in the article. And there were just single adjective questions. And then you'd answer on a 3-point Likert type scale. No, this does not represent me, it somewhat represents me, or this represents me well. And so it would just be kind of like the one-word adjective. So imaginative, yes, this represents me, that correlates to openness, or unimaginative, which would again be the negatively worded example of that. To analyze these results, they did a perimeter estimation using a graded response model, GRM, and in that case, the GRM is actually kind of just used to distinguish or estimate a discriminating variable to compare all the scores. So in this case, they actually just used mean to compare the scores. And then model fit, which is, I've never seen this before, and I thought it was an interesting use of the chi-square. Rather than just computing the chi-square, they actually computed chi-square plus the degrees of freedom and actually made a ratio of it. So it's one score that's a ratio of the chi-square over the degrees of freedom. And so in the results, as I just said, the perimeters were discrimination and then difficulty. And so again, the perimeters are means. So that's the average mean of the scores. So you can see positive is 1.24 is the average mean, and negative is 0.39. So positive worded items did have higher discrimination. There's more correlation between the individual and how they answered, so more of a linear relationship. And then with difficulty, it was the opposite. So you can see the positive have lower means while the negative have higher means. They did 2 difficulty scores. So the negative questions were found to be more difficult. They also kind of looked at the levels of information provided by these scores, and although they didn't list the average means of the scores, negative questions were found to provide less information. And then the model fit statistics, which is again the chi-square ratio value, they computed it using free and fixed values. And so that means they either free means they just looked at all the perimeters, and fixed means they made the perimeters equivalent. So those unobservable variables for either positive and negative values could be equal or equivalent. And then singlet, doublet, and triplet means how many variables they were looking at. So either one variable could be influencing 2 or 3. And for these scores, good scores are usually 3 or less. That's kind of the heuristic that's positively associated with this. So as you can see in this case, the fixed values kind of had to be ignored. They're just way too high. But then the free values are lower in each case. In study 2, they wanted to imitate the first study, but with a more typical measure of personality. So they had 495 participants. This time they were a recent alum from a large Midwestern university. They did random sampling, so they sent an email to 3,000 recent alums in the last 5 years. The response rate was 16.5%. Again, they were majority female, majority Caucasian. This time the mean age is 27.2. So like I said, a more typical personality inventory was used. This case from the International Personality Item Pool. 100 items, 20 items for each of the big 5 traits, so still ocean. And this time it was a 1 to 5 scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. It was also full phrases. So rather than just having happy or unhappy or social or unsocial, they'd have, I'm a person who normally likes spending time around other people. And that would be correlated for extroversion. So they were full phrases. And the analysis was the same as in study 1. So here, the results were still different, although not as distinct. So positive was just slightly larger for discrimination than negative. Again, levels of information, they did give the averages this time, and positive provided slightly more information than negative questions. This time with the fit statistics, they actually, rather than do free and fixed parameters, they looked at included or excluded. And so included is when they kept in the negatively worded items and looked at the fit, and excluded was when they actually removed the negatively worded items to look at fit. And so as you can see, when the negatively worded items are removed, the majority of scores, besides emotional stability, are actually below that 3 marker. So it's a much better fit when the negatively item words are removed. So again, throughout this, you can see that negatively worded items showed consistently lower levels of information and discrimination. So what are the possible explanations for this? First, there could be those extraneous variables that are influencing the words. For instance, it could just be carelessness. People aren't paying attention. So, there's that less variability. A second one they suggested were UN or unwords kind of lack endorsement. Those unwords like unhappy, unsocial, they're often negatives, and oftentimes we really don't want to associate ourselves with that. So there's kind of less variability in responses to that. And then just model fit. So why is there consistently lower levels of these things? Well, as you can see in the models, perhaps the negatively worded items just aren't representing the same thing. They're not representing personality the way the positively worded items were, which is why they don't fit in the model. So that again would be positively and negatively worded items had considerably different psychometric functioning, so they could be measuring different things. So implications, how do researchers incorporate this knowledge into their studies? I thought this was really relevant to all of us, just because if we are conducting senior research or in research other research classes, many times we often may use surveys. And so what can we learn from this? First off, you really want to consider why you might want to include the negatively worded items. Are they measuring what you want to measure? Or is it worth it to include them just to make sure people are carefully going through the study? Secondly, they also suggested maybe incorporating IRT, so again, the item response theory, more into studies, just because it allows us a more nuanced perspective of kind of the questions we're asking and looking at variables behind the questions. And finally, limitations and future directions. So one limitation was that this wasn't looking at the practical implications. It was just looking at kind of the knowledge behind it, if it was psychometrically similar. So future research should see if there's a reason why we might want to include the negatively worded items. Maybe that does provide something valuable. Secondly, a portion of this study did involve student responses. So maybe they do respond differently from adults. We all take a lot of surveys, so that could influence it in some way. And finally, it would be really interesting to see what the moderating variables are. They offer that intelligence or cognitive complexity could play a role, but obviously this study didn't look at those in particular. So that would also be another direction for future research. Otherwise, thank you. That was my presentation.
That was terrific. Maybe we have some questions or comments from you. question. This is a really interesting topic that I've never really considered before. I was wondering how you sort of got interested in this topic.
Truthfully, I was looking for articles for senior research, and one of the authors, this was just another, from one of my papers, just another paper that he wrote. And I just thought it was really interesting and pretty relevant to a lot of things we're involved in.
That's an important question, because where do questions come from? Another way of raising it. It's interesting to figure out how people get into the line of research that they do, and how you come across them. It's important to understand where our questions come from. One of the many things I liked about this was for me, the surprising effect that just by putting the prefix "un" in front of something, I would have guessed that you get the, if you will, the compliment of that. Somebody agrees that they're a very happy person. They should very negatively endorse I'm an unhappy person. But it turns out that those are not equally predictive. Mm-hmm. We teach from the first week of intro to psych that a correlation of positive 0.7 has as much predictive value as one of negative 0.7. Right? And so you might think, well, if you just negate the word, we'll get just the opposite trend, but it actually isn't the case. Right? So it's almost as if the word happy isn't just the opposite of the word unhappy, but there's something else going on there. There's an asymmetry that I find really interesting. And on this idea of cognitive asymmetries, it's a very famous type of test that maybe people have heard about if you take it in course in cognition. People were asking, cognitive psychologists were asking participants to respond to how similar certain countries were to other countries. So how similar is the U.S. to Canada versus how similar is the U.S. to Nigeria? Right? Okay, you might imagine that, and you're not told how to think about similarity. You just give them you come up with all kinds of interesting asymmetries like this. But it turns out that people would say something like North Korea is far more similar to China than China is to North Korea. And you might say, well, how can that be the case, right? It's the China-North Korean connection, right? How can you possibly find an asymmetry there? But there are huge asymmetries. So it makes us think about our own cognition and how it's not at all symmetrical. And I think the data are showing that. Some other questions or comments? Okay, one more time. Can we thank Victoria for a very nice presentation? Okay, so there we go. And we'll look forward to having our TED conversation on Wednesday. Again, please remember that those very tightly follow the PowerPoints of that video. Okay. Thanks, Victoria.
Yeah.
Let me stop the projector.